Ari Ben Ari Ben Am is one of the top, I would say, world expert when it comes to information warfare, especially when it comes to the not only the cyber and the technical part, but also a little bit the geopolitical and the acknowledgments of what's behind the scenes and the modus operandi when states are applying it and so on. Is a CEO and co-founder of Telemetry Data Labs and is an adjunct fellow at the Foundation for Defense of Democracies. He has also a blog, which we'll share later, which is fascinating to read. Some great stuff there if you want to follow some of Ari's insights there. Some of you may came from that and from his social media. So we are very happy to have you here today, Ari. Thank you so much for joining us.
Sorry, I wanted to turn off my mic there. Olin, thank you so much for having me. It's a pleasure. I'm looking forward to spending the next hour or so chatting with you about one of the most interesting topics I think we have to discuss nowadays.
So, Ari, let me jump straight forward. I mean, information operations, it's a big word. And we know a lot of the, I would say, the literature or a lot of the thinking about it was done during the years of the Cold War, post World War II. It was a very different times there. And today, with social media, the internet, and so on, it's a completely different game. We just recently saw stuff going on in Indonesia, in Nepal. When it comes to that, we don't know what's the mix of which countries there, but there's definitely a lot of stuff going on. So my first question for you today is if kind of take the macro and go from the high altitude to the lower. Can you kind of provide us which one are the leading states that or the actors that we're seeing are applying their information operations in the world today? That's one. And two, can you give us some example of the top leading information operation campaigns that we see today? Not necessarily by those actors, but that the ones that we see today. Maybe we'll start with the campaigns and then the actors. But can you give us kind of a short overview of what are those top two, three campaigns and two, three actors and that we see today, and how they're basically applying information operation in the cyber age?
Absolutely. So just to take it back a moment, like you said earlier, we had the initial earlier days of this, and now everything changed with social media, right? Now, that's important because we see nation state actors going back to some of the previous methods that we had, say, pre-internet. So let's take it back just a moment. The history of this space, right, began in, the historical frames of information warfare, pamphlet dropping, creating fake outlets, radio stations, that sort of thing. And then, of course, with social media, people started creating botnets and so on online to shape opinion. Now we see nation states like Russia, China, and Iran, which are called the big three in the space for a good reason, as they are the three most active countries in the space. And by the way, that's not to say that Western countries or others don't also, of course, carry out influence operations. They most definitely do. There have been multiple cases of the U.S. Having carried out influence operations covertly that have been discussed in Reuters and other outlets. France and other countries, of course, also as well. So everyone does it, just as an aside. Now, going back to your question, we see Russia, China, and Iran being the three main actors active today. And we see them interestingly adopting also full spectrum, which is a term I'm sure that we'll discuss later on more in depth, methods beyond just the typical use of online networks and botnets. Now, that relates to the campaigns that we see also as well. So if we break it down by the top three of Russia, China, and Iran, Russia is arguably, for better or for worse, funnily enough, I of course investigate Russian activity all the time, but it's not my preferred country to focus on. They still are arguably the most active globally, though. They have multiple global campaigns working in the US, Europe, Southeast Asia, and beyond via multiple different vectors. I would point out in particular threat actor Storm 1516. That is the Microsoft terminology. The recorded future terminology for that group is called CopyCop. And that's a fascinating group that's affiliated with the Russian political philosopher Alexander Dugin. They recently were sanctioned. One of their key figures was sanctioned by the United States government and so on. And they're also, of course, tied to the Russian GRU. Now, they operate by running a network of real political think tanks and thought groups in Russia or so on that cooperate with people abroad to create content. The ongoing Operation CopyCop was active targeting in the US elections, which is why they were sanctioned. And it was most notable for two reasons. Firstly, because they brought an American on board, an American expat, fugitive, whatever you want to call him, John Mark Dougan, who fled to Russia and recently was awarded the Presidential Medal of Freedom, whatever the equivalent of that is in Russia by Putin himself for his operations. And he is actually not only in charge of running their operations targeting the US and the US elections as well as Europe, but also he was in charge of leading their AI digital transformation. right? Now, we saw a little bit of that with another flagship Russian operation called Doppelganger, which I'm sure many people here have heard, which is still ongoing, but has since waned a little bit in its activity. That one was known for creating a large number of fake domains that would impersonate well-known news sites, hence the name Doppelganger. Whereas with CopyCop, we see a lot of use of AI to generate content and create these websites that don't necessarily impersonate other sites, although they do on occasion. And then perhaps most importantly, we see also them increasingly utilizing real human actors, right, as part of their videos. So they'll create, not using deepfake technology or anything, real videos of actors that they pay, be they freelancers or people they acquire otherwise, to create these, minute, 2 minute long videos and then use that as content. So, as I said, just a review, because that's a lot of content we just covered. We have CopyCop, which is run by the American guy, allegedly, by the way, I should say allegedly in this case, right? He although has been, called up for bias activity by other outlets, the Washington Post and Digital and so on. And then we have Doppelganger, which runs all these networks of fake domains. So those are targeting primarily Europe and America, but also other countries. There's also Operation Overload, run by the Russians. And Operation Overload is interesting in that it directly targets journalists, fact checkers, and many other groups seeking to have them cover their own activity and to overwhelm them simultaneously. So they'll send hundreds to thousands of emails to journalists and other groups seeking to have them cover the content that they create, which is a fascinating tactic, right? They'll send them in the lead of their own IO content that they create to then have them, of course, promote that online. So all in all, very interesting stuff from Russia. Those are three of the main ones. They do have other ones, of course, globally. But we see there also, by the way, for example, in Moldova as well, if we have time, we can get into it later on. We also see them, of course, integrating beyond the online activity. They integrate the full spectrum of cyber-enabled and physical influence operations quite effectively as well. So maybe we'll get into that later on, Bruce.
Just to touch on Russia for a second, can you just shortly talk a little bit about Wagner, the Wagner group, and how, if you can, about what they're doing? Because everybody talk about Wagner from the perspective of mercenaries operating primarily in Africa. They used to be in Ukraine until the revolt that they had, but there is another side, which is the whole IO campaigns that Wagner is very much involved in. Can you touch a
Absolutely.
little bit about that?
For sure. And this is, by the way, an important high-level dynamic that we'll discuss via this example. In Russia, you have, of course, the state-directed operations, right, from the GRU, the SVR, the FSB, the Kremlin, and so on, that they order and carry out their own operations. But there's also a very large subset of oligarchs and other people in Russia that run their own influence operations targeting the West to curry favor with the Russian government and with Putin and so on. So you have oligarchs and people like Prigozhin, the now deceased Prigozhin, right, with Wagner being folded under other government control inside of Russia. Let's say we were doing this stuff historically. Wagner under Prigozhin ran multiple influence operations in Africa. Often via Telegram and other sources to promote their own interests and, of course, promote Russian interests in Africa. And they were involved in a number of the coups there. Since Prigozhin attempted to essentially revolt against Putin and take over Russia, and he since failed and was killed and so on. They've been folded back into the Russian regime in various ways. But one of their older outlets called the RFBI, which is a play, of course, on the FBI, the Federal Bureau of Investigation, they call it the Foundation to Battle Injustice. Is a formerly Prigozhin and Wagner linked group that was tight with them that they would, of course, use to run operations globally as well. So they still are active running operations under the R-FBI, the Russian Foundation to Battle Injustice, which is a group that we can look at also. And they run operations in Africa and Europe too, promoting Russian interests and separatism and trying to weaken European states as well. So and there are other groups that we can get into also as well too. First, to say the least, these are just some of the leading ones, let's say. So Wagner, to summarize, not active in the way that it was prior, where it had a large degree of independence, so long as it promoted Russian interests. But their vestiges are still active, and they're still doing things under the RFBI and their local African outlets that they still run.
And if we go to other actors, you mentioned China, you mentioned Iran. What can you disclose about China, for example? Because I think the case with China is also interesting because of TikTok and their control of that social media and all of that. Can you go into a little bit talking about China, their modus operandi, and what can you kind of tell us in terms of how China operates?
Absolutely. So China's a fascinating case in that we in the West, and I'm using the West in a very collective, term here in this regard, kind of think of China as the boogeyman in many regards in this respect. And they certainly do run operations, but we're still waiting for that incredible, super high quality Chinese operation to come out that we really haven't seen quite lately. Obviously, they're much more invested in TikTok and some of the more passive methods, which we can discuss perhaps separately, although I would put that in a broader category than I would say, information warfare in the more targeted sense. But perhaps we can get into that momentarily. Before we get into TikTok, then let me just discuss then what we see with China. The Chinese flagship operation is an operation called Spamouflage, which I'm sure some people here at least have heard of, which is a sprawling network of low investment, low quality spam, quote unquote, assets across YouTube, Medium, Twitter, and other platforms that they utilize to target, say, the Taiwanese elections and so on as well. And it's been running for years with quite literally, I would believe at this point, hundreds of thousands to millions of assets taken down across all of the various platforms. Now, the main interesting point of Spamouflage, beyond the fact that it's just spammy and comparatively uninteresting beyond that, is that there have been interesting cases of development of them utilizing AI in interesting cases. So, for example, when Spamouflage and other Chinese actors targeted the Taiwanese elections, right, the most recent ones, we saw two interesting cases. The first one was the fake biography of Tsai Ing-wen, the previous president of Taiwan, that they created with AI. It was several hundred pages long, called The Secret History of Tsai Ing-wen. And in Chinese, it sounds better, obviously. And it, made up a lot of pejorative statements and lies about Tsai Ing-wen, and they shared that to discredit her party, even though she wasn't running again as part of the elections. And they promoted that fake book via Spamouflage assets. The other thing that we saw was a forged document alleging that the current president of Taiwan, Lai Ching-te, had an illegitimate son. Based on paternity tests. That was also promoted by Spamouflage outlet assets, and it may have been AI generated, although it seemed to have not been. But that was shared most interestingly on hacking forums first for seeding, which is a common tactic we see from Russia and Iran, and that was the first that I was aware of, at least for China. Now, Spamouflage aside, and Spamouflage, of course, gets a lot of attention, and arguably rightfully so, China does run other types of operations. There have been multiple cases that we can look at historically that they've run, but the most interesting one I think that's relevant recently is their campaign that they have that fuses covert influence operations with stratcoms. Now, I have a piece I'm working on this topic, but if you follow the Chinese Ministry of Public Security and the Ministry of State Security, their domestic and intelligence organizations, you can see that they've engaged in a multi-year long campaign regarding starting off with reports from private sector companies in response to Western cyber attribution of Chinese activity, and then moving up at a larger scale to cover Volt Typhoon. So this is a longer term operation. So let me give you guys some background here. Starting about 10 years ago, the West, primarily the US and the UK, and now other countries, began attributing Chinese cyber activity, right? Their operations targeting various companies and agencies and so on internationally. China was not a fan of this and is highly sensitive to this as a topic. And they began running stratcoms campaigns, right? Often to via Chinese private companies to refute these claims and then also reflect the blame to Western actors, saying, in fact, it wasn't the Americans that hacked, it wasn't us that hacked this company and whatever happened to be, it was the Americans that did it. And also the Americans hack us all the time and so on and that sort of thing, right? So it was a very reflective campaign essentially regarding stratcoms of cyber attribution. Now that began to take on certain elements of covert activity several years ago, and there were certain Spamouflage clusters that did target I'm sorry, Western attributions of Chinese cyber activity. But most interestingly, Chinese agencies, mainly front organizations run via the MPS and the MSS, like for example, the CVRC, right, which is the China Computer Virus Emergency Response Center, began promoting these very long form technical reporting documents on alleged cases of, for example, how starting off, I'm sorry, I'm a little bit out of it today, so I'll get back into they'll be more articulate now regarding Volt Typhoon. So when America, via Microsoft and the CISA and other groups, attributed the Chinese cyber operation Volt Typhoon, there was this whole hullabaloo about it. China responded by publishing a three-part series of reports saying that Volt Typhoon wasn't a Chinese cyber operation, but is in fact an American cyber operation organized by Microsoft and Chinese and American intelligence agencies and so on and so forth. So not to bore you guys with the details, but what we have here was a long form Chinese, more classic, let's say, information warfare campaign, right? With these falsified or not forged in this case, right? But falsified documents being supported by inauthentic assets promoting narratives in a specific topic. So that's, I think, an interesting case that we should discuss with China because it's more Chinese in many respects. It's less
And
focused on, I'm sorry, yeah.
yeah, and if you compare China to Russia, where would you say is the difference? I would say like in 2 points that you say, look,
Oh,
the
absolutely.
Russian are A, the Chinese are B.
Russians focus on full spectrum activity and they have no problems doing stuff that would be considered illegal or highly escalatory, be it highly escalatory cyber activity, physical influence operations. For example, the Russian agents are alleged to have paid Bulgarians to place French coffins under the Eiffel Tower during the Olympics to protest possible French involvement in the war in Ukraine, right? And so on. and utilizing more tactical forgeries of things, whereas the Chinese tend to usually emphasize the importance of strategic communications, stratcoms, and less inauthentic activity at a larger scale than other actors, right? So China takes the more strategic route of trying to shape the global media space in many ways, whereas Russia takes a more, let's say, certainly strategic, but more targeted approach in terms of the way that it utilizes operations. And they'll use, like we said, cyber more effectively, physical operations, and so on. We haven't seen that with China yet. I haven't seen a case of China running a physical influence operation or running true cyber-enabled operations quite as of yet, right? Cyber-enabled in this case meaning hacking and leaking documents, let's say, right, or so on. China focuses on maintaining a bit of a higher position in the kind of the ethics of the matter, I would say, as well. There's also, we can get more into that. Sorry, yeah.
And you mentioned also there is Iran as the third actor. Can we go a little bit into what distinguishes Iran from these? What distinguishes
Yeah.
what is similar to Iran to the other two actors?
Ab Absolutely. So what China and Russia are, high quality cyber actors with, reasonable quality intelligence services that can carry out operations of all kinds. Iran is a very important actor in the IO space, but they lack a lot of the capabilities that Russia and China have. But what they make up for in terms of the pure capabilities, be it in cyber or information warfare, they make up for with let's say spunk and the willingness to take on risky operations. So ever since the Israel-Iran war began, arguably with the Israel-Hamas war, but more so a bit afterwards, we've seen Iran fully embrace the spectrum of influence operations, ranging from online influence operations to physical influence operations to cyber-enabled influence operations, and doing them with, frankly, reckless abandon. Right, targeting critical infrastructure in America. For example, they hacked into a water plant and then, promoted that online to, scare Americans into not supporting Israel, for example, in the war. There have been cases of them targeting the Israeli industrial base. And in fact, we actually saw the US government and the Israeli government recently publish an advisory on one Iranian group called ASA, I always mispronounce their name, but that's the current group that they happen to be. They're well known for running cyber-enabled influence operations. So they'll hack into a given group, a given target, right? Whether it's the Israeli Olympic Commission or an Emirates-based company or a Swedish telecommunications firm like they did, for example, and they'll run influence operations resulting from that cyber operation, right? So in the case of Sweden, for example, ASA hacked into the Swedish telecommunications firm. Then, using that access, they sent thousands of SMSs to Swedish citizens, telling them to come out against, for example, a recent Swedish far-right protest that involved the burning of Qurans. You may recall this was back when Sweden wanted to join NATO, and there were multiple protests happening back then, also in Sweden, about the role of Islam in the country, and so on. So Iran took advantage of that to hack a telecommunications firm to send out SMSs, and they also created their own network of hacktivist front groups. Now, that's an important point also as well. A lot of this activity, in order to amplify the impact of it, they run via front groups, right? So Russia and Iran do this primarily, much less so China. I haven't seen cases of China doing this really as much. In order to amplify the psychological impact of a given cyber or influence operation, they'll create a front group online, usually on Telegram, give it some sort of hacktivist name, right? Often infused with justice or religious imagery, and then use that to take credit for the operation and amplify it further online as well. And we see this, by the way, targeting not only Israel. They've targeted the UAE. Iranian actors are suspected of having interrupted the television broadcast in the UAE to protest their relations with Israel and so on during the recent war. They've also targeted Albania. They've targeted America, Sweden, and other countries with these fused operations. And I think the point here to keep in mind is that especially in IO, your technical acumen, while certainly important, isn't super critical. If you're willing to take the risk and to be a bit creative in the way that you operate, you can have a lot of really impactful, interesting operations that can do a lot with a little bit. And Iran is certainly the least resourced of the two, whether it's Russia or China.
One of the things that kind of is notable is the increasing amount, or I would say the crucial role that AI is playing when it comes to information operations. Where do you see the use of AI within the methods used by actors such as China, Russia, and Iran, or other actors? Like how dependent or how big is the use of AI is being done when it comes to
You
IO?
know, Not dissimilarly to the global economy, we're kind of at the end of the AI bubble a little bit, let's say, right? There's a lot of discussion of that recently, right? Um, for example, uh, what do I mean by that? At the beginning, when AI came out, think of the deepfakes of many years ago, right? For example, that we discussed, the earlier level deepfakes, they were very crude and lower quality. You could obviously tell that they were fake. Now they've gotten much better, but we still haven't seen truly a huge adoption of them. Now, there have been some cases of AI really impacting things, but we'll get into that, for example, in Slovakia, Indonesia, and a few other cases, and we'll discuss those examples momentarily. But on the whole, AI has been important, but has been, I think, lacking in its utility for the space. And I'll explain why. I think the reason why is that local models simply do not cut it, right? And if you're a threat actor, you want to be carrying out high quality operations, you want to create high quality content, right? That AI needs to be running essentially on either very, very powerful hardware locally on some sort of open source model that you happen to be running. Otherwise, the content won't come out well. Now, anybody who's played with a local model will know that's important. When you compare the output of a locally hosted model not connected to the internet to, say, ChatGPT or a Claude, or whatever it happens to be, right, one of these cloud-hosted models with far superior infrastructure, the difference in quality is night and day. So that's one thing that we see also. Firstly, local models put out lower quality content, so actors are incentivized to use cloud-based models like ChatGPT and Claude and so on, right, and not the locally hosted ones. That means that when they use those, they get exposed. And we've seen these AI companies release regular threat intelligence reports. Anthropic released one just a week or two ago that I covered on my blog, where they discuss this, for example, and you can see exactly how these actors are beginning to utilize AI, whether it's for cyber or influence operations, or of course both. And on the whole, even though the quality of the output is still much higher, generally speaking, the output is either low-level text generation, which they can do, right? Obviously, they can write content quite well for websites and so on and that sort of thing. But even then, if you get used to ChatGPT or Claude, you can start to identify it, right? Oh, and has this ever happened to you? You ever see someone send you an email and you can kind of tell it's ChatGPT, right? And so on. Humans can do that well, and that can be also better identified via detectors, even though it's still, of course, not perfect, right? But even then, text is a big one, and then we see more kind of automation and operational enhancements. It's not revolutionizing this to the space that we saw earlier. Now, you can look at a few of the true AI-centric operations that exist. For example, CopyCop, right, which is heavily AI-centric, where they're utilizing local servers in Russia to generate content for domains. They can put out a lot of content much more quickly, but frankly, it's still not revolutionizing it. It's just making the content pipeline work more effectively. We have seen Iran do this also as well. There was an investigation that I looked at where I looked at a previous investigation from Microsoft and OpenAI. You can see it on my page at the FTD, for example, that where we published it, where we saw Iranian actors utilizing ChatGPT and other outlets very effectively. But on the whole, it hasn't still revolutionized it. It makes creating content easier. It makes website development easier. It makes all these things easier. But frankly, for a nation state, that's not a huge advantage. It's nice. It's nice and it makes it more cost effective, but not a big deal.
One of the biggest concerns that we hear at Wikistrat from companies and from governments is that it's not only the use of AI for IO, but it's the actual manipulation of AI for IO, i.e., to take the information that the LLM models use, in which the AI is dependent on, to manipulate that in order to generate the results that will serve the IO campaigns, which is kind of a more advanced IO, I would say, from this perspective,
Abs
because it's not using AI, but it's manipulating AI. Do we see
Absolutely.
that, or is that something that we see more frequently? How would you refer to that?
Absolutely. I'll get into that. I just want to bring up one point about deepfakes and their current level of quality, and then we'll get into that also. There was a lot of concern a year or two ago about deepfakes, no one being able to tell what's real and what's fake. That has not really materialized yet, I would say, on the whole. There are solid detection methods, and even though in Slovakia, an audio deepfake, and by the way, audio deepfakes are, I think, much more impactful than video and image deepfakes at this point in time, on the whole, was able to possibly impact the results of the election. We still haven't seen the doomsday scenario at that point where you can't tell if anything's real online. Now, going into your question about the LLM grooming, NewsGuard has a company that's done a lot of great research on this, and it does work to an extent. Now, it requires also manipulating SEO or search engines to get them to cover the websites that you create more effectively, or alternatively, to create teams that work on platforms like Reddit or Wikipedia, that sort of thing, to create this data and so on. And there's been a lot of research covered on this, of course, by the use of these things from Russia and other groups, right? For example, people will create these articles and then cite them in other websites and that sort of thing, and it will groom the LLM. It's difficult to work with. Now, the upside of this is that in so much as there's an active counter influence operation community active today, and there are companies that are working on this space, it's easier for any company that wants to work in this context, or any AI company that wants to work in this context, to avoid this to a certain degree. And I would say on the whole, from my very anecdotal testing, ChatGPT and Anthropic are doing a reasonable job of this, right? Where they kind of know what to filter out on the whole in many ways. But it's going to be a problem going forward, certainly, that the ability to impact LLMs is going to be big. I think that it means that we're going to see certain sites like Reddit, for example, which is a huge site for LM scraping, become important battlegrounds for the space. They were important before, certainly, but not as critical as, say, Twitter or Facebook or other platforms, right? Now I think that that's going to change the importance of dynamics where people invest because now it adds a strategic level of investment to IO, right? Not just, okay, I'm going to run an operation to swing the people of this country to think one way or the other, right? I'm going to do this and then set the narrative on it possibly amongst LLM chatbots. So we still are in the early days of that, but we are seeing initial results of this, and it can be effective if done well.
Now, a lot of the IO discussion is always involving around the state actors. We started with obviously with the state actors, the what we call the usual suspects, but we see more and more IO campaigns being targeted either by states against private sector or by private sector against private sector slash individuals against private sector, etc. Can you give us a little bit more an explanation of how do we see the private sector being impacted by IO today? Because in the past, it wasn't such a big deal for them, but I think the war in Ukraine and other things are kind of causing it to become more of an issue for the private sector. Can you refer to that a little bit?
Absolutely. And I think you hit the nail on the head with mentioning the war in Ukraine, which is when we start to really see this begin. Prior to the war in Ukraine, there were some cases of China promoting Huawei and ZTE and other companies and so on via covert assets, right? But it was more of a promotion element and less of a, denigrative operation, let's say. Following the war in Ukraine, we saw a dynamic emerge that we would see later with China and Iran, of course, in which, of course, Russian operations would target Ukrainian companies, American companies, British companies, anybody involved in supporting Ukraine to some degree via multiple methods, right? Whether it's cyber operations, influence operations, and so on, to besmirch them, to target their facilities physically, to call upon for protests or boycotts of them, and so on. That dynamic that we saw in Ukraine has become active also in other places. For example, of course, Iran consistently targets Israeli companies, Emirati companies, and American companies, including private sector companies that service critical infrastructure as a result of the ongoing war. We've seen many cyber-enabled influence operations, and that includes, by the way, the doxing of employees. So not just giving the company a bad name, let's say, right, but targeting the individual employees, creating wanted posters of them and so on, and then sharing them online to intimidate these people into being, essentially stopping to do certain things and also calling on people to target them otherwise as well. So that we've seen in many cases. We've also seen, I think, in the Chinese element that campaign that I mentioned earlier, right, of the Chinese cyber attribution campaign, trying to counter Western cyber attribution. That campaign of the series of reports the Chinese groups put out targeted multiple cyber companies, right, private sector cyber companies. For example, Microsoft, Palantir, and other American companies, be they defense contractors or not, were targeted by Chinese actors in these reports. And now that information is out there claiming that Microsoft is trying to bribe American federal agencies and they're targeting China to promote the China threat theory and all this, that we don't need to get into the whole narrative and so on, right? But it's definitely there. Any company that is now involved to some degree in these geopolitical areas is going to have a hard time. And as AI and tech becomes more politicized and militarized, it's going to become more and more relevant, I think. Companies, I think, are also increasingly seen as fair game. They've been the case, arguably, for corporate espionage and espionage from the private sector from, governments in the past years, right? Obviously not Western ones on the whole, but still, I think we're going to see that become a much more prominent thing going forward. But we're still in the early stages of it. These wars are giving us the advanced peak that we need to see what's going to happen later on.
And from where you're following this, do you see that private companies today are more prepared or less prepared to be targets of IO campaigns? Because it seems as if it's something that companies kind of are aware of the risk, but not really prepared for the risk. Do you share that opinion?
I would say the awareness is still not even quite there yet from the conversations that I've had. And I've seen many other companies be targeted, for example, tech companies in other spaces and so on. I can't go into too much detail, right? But there have been many cases of certain key, let's say, key industries being targeted at a larger scale. There's still a lot of foundational discussion to be had. Who's responsible for it? Is it the physical security team? Is it the CISO? Is it the PR and Stratcoms team? Who's handling it at the company. It's still not entirely clear in many cases. There's no protocol for that. Just like it took time for companies to adapt to, say, ransomware, for example, right? If you get hacked by ransomware, who's going to handle it? We're still seeing that happen nowadays. So I would say on the whole, companies are definitely not prepared for this. Need to be considering it as a possible risk vector, right? To be considered. What they can do, I think there are many things that they can do in contrast to regular cyber, defense, which they can of course have and should have going forward to make sure that they're secured. It's important to invest in EASM, external asset surface management, but also to expand that into not just all of your devices and your infrastructure and so on in your given company and your sites, right? But your employees. the same vectors that lead to companies getting hacked now, for example, info stealers leading to exposed OAuth tokens and that sort of thing being leaked and enabling hackers to simply take an employee's email address, password, and token and then access the company, the same thing applies to their own company's personal data online, right? The personal data, for example, of the senior executives or of the employees or so on. It's all available for free or for minimal cost on Telegram, the dark web, and so on, right? And can be purchased and used to besmirch the company, for example. Additionally, assets that aren't necessarily considered super critical can be utilized. For example, CC camera, right? CCTV cameras in a given company can be utilized to take video snippets of inside the office and then, make the company look bad or intimidate employees, right? And so on. There are many ways that this threat can be, employed against companies that have a cyber or physical element to them, but aren't necessarily the biggest cyber threat per se, if you will. So we're still working this out. The exact model isn't clear. I mean, obviously, I think that the right approach is going to be something like having, MSSPs adapt this for smaller and medium-sized companies, and larger companies will invest in their own teams for this as well. But we're still working on developing basic awareness, and then from there we can move to developing internal programs for this sort of thing.
So let me ask you some questions from the chat here that we receive as we're talking about companies. A question here: how do you see the role of synthetic data data evolving in AI model development, in particular for companies that don't have good access for good property information or lack the resources to manage their own information?
That's a good question. I haven't seen much regarding synthetic data in the AI model development. I also don't do a whole ton of AI model development or training myself, to be entirely frank. It's not something that I deal with. I mean, we tell my company provide Telegram data at scale and so on, but I don't get involved in much foundational model training, so I couldn't really tell you much there. Usually, the issues come in not at the meta, the foundational model, but more just in kind of the general data being used to feed it, right? The books and articles being scanned and so on. At least from the IO component or the information warfare component. So
which
I don't
which
have
goes
much.
which goes back to our discussion about Reddit and that's the future
Yeah,
battlefield and so on.
there are ways to do this, and listen, some of these models have stronger foundations historically than others. Anthropic, for example, got in a lot of trouble for their scanning of all these books as they were accused of. I believe it's allegedly, I should say. I'm not sure if that court case has been resolved. They scanned all these books physically and so on to train their models. That'll probably provide them with a better foundation or factual foundation to work with to add with internet data. There are ways around this. You can have high quality data be tagged in, and then if it conflicts that, for example, have that be the winning source. I don't have too much detail to give you there too, because I simply don't deal with that level of AI model training myself quite often. But it's going to be an interesting field that's going to have to develop more effectively over the coming few years.
Moving from private sector to countries, we spoke about Iran, we spoke about China, we spoke about Russia. There's a question here in the chat about about Turkey, and the question is, what about Turkish IO campaigns? Do you see them developing their own unique paradigm, or they belong to one of the paradigms that we spoke about when we talked about those other three big ones?
So I'll be entirely honest. I've looked at influence operations globally from, America to Venezuela to Indonesia to you name it, to other countries and so on. I haven't seen much coming out of Turkey. I'm sure that they do it. I'm sure that they run many in either domestically in, the Kurdish areas of Turkey, in Syria and other parts of the world. I haven't seen much of it. A lot of it goes through their overt activity, right? TRT is a large channel, Anadolu, those sort of things, the state media agencies and so on. But I would imagine, like many countries, that a lot of their activity is oriented domestically, especially with the way things have changed recently, perhaps with some happening in Syria or some counter extremism work also as well. But I haven't, again, I don't want to mislead you. I haven't looked much at their own activity in the space, so I couldn't tell you much more about a paradigm there. But we can look at other countries and go from there also. Yeah, I wouldn't be surprised. I'm seeing the chat here. I wouldn't be surprised at the rudimentary also as well. I usually try to look at the more advanced things also there.
And there's a question about Nepal, and I'll talk about. So I wanna kind of unite, even though it's not the same. But Nepal, Indonesia, let's call it social unrest. How much do we see social unrest in one country exploited, maybe not driven by another country, but exploited by those other actors when it comes to you see a social unrest in a country about legitimate issues such as corruption or human rights or whatever. How much do you see those kind of issues being exploited by other countries? Like the IO is such a in such a high level that it can actually react fast to events on the ground versus planned and targeted from above and then being indicated into the public.
So a lot of this is a great question, and it's certainly a very poignant one. And we've seen, again, I would say the Israel-Iran war and the Ukraine-Russia war are the two main examples of this also as well, right? Where one conflict arguably limited to a certain region of the world that shouldn't really interest many people outside of that one specific area kind of balloons out of control, right, and becomes this kind of global topic of interest for for better or for worse, let's say. And we see that especially with everyone. When the Russia-Ukraine war broke out, China and Iran jumped on it, of course, to promote their own narratives in many ways. And there were cases of this, for example, the Ukraine biolabs theory, that narrative that came out, you may have heard of that, where one Russian pro-Russian individual claimed that America had biological weapons research labs in Ukraine that Russia was targeting. The Chinese and Iranians ran with that narrative and promoted it and so on. And the reason for this is that it's simply convenient. Usually at the end of the day, the core narratives and interests of these things are shared, right? If Russia is running influence operation targeting Ukraine as part of the war, for example, the goals of that are usually going to align with China and Iran and other countries, Venezuela, whatever it happens to be, that want to then get involved, right? So the narratives already exist, the contents already exist, and the most important part are also the people involved. Oftentimes, state media outlets and these journalists and freelancers that work for these outlets can serve as key pivot points, right? So it's not uncommon for someone to work for, say, these outlets or multiple outlets at the same time, Iranian and state media outlets, Chinese state media outlets, and so on. And then the accounts and assets that follow them can simply take their content as they promote it and push it from there. So it's all about having a much more effective, holistic system from the state media to that journalist or influencer to the covert assets and other groups, right? That enables essentially a very rapid response time, right? I've seen cases, for example, of state media promoting reasonable quality content within hours, let's say, of a given event, and that's promoted, of course, by inauthentic networks that are, automatically reposting and sharing their activity. The other point I would bring up is that we've seen a real convergence of narratives and content, especially following the Israel-Iran war that began prior during the Russia-Ukraine war, of course. But with Israel and Iran, Russia, China, and Iran really are all singing the same tune for the most part on this and exploiting it for the huge societal issues that it causes in the West and in Europe and America. And it's in their interest to promote all these things also as well. So there's a rare case where everyone is truly working in lockstep for the same types of goals. And we've seen as a result, operations take on essentially the same tone, reuse the same content almost verbatim with no issue. So as the world splits into two, let's say to two larger groups, it's just easier for other people to share it. 5 years ago, China would want to have, say, a different line on a different topic than Russia or Iran. Not quite as much anymore.
So one of the questions that we are repeatedly asked is how effective IO is. And I want to take that question divided into two parts because we talked about that a little bit. One is IO against external actors, i.e., Iran against Israel, Russia against Ukraine, and so on. And the other is IO for internal purposes against opposition or against narratives that could harm the government. So, how effective is it at the end of the day? Is it more noise, or is it actually a call for action, and it actually has a critical, massive impact on day-to-day politics of a government?
Well, I'm going to disappoint you and say that no one knows for sure, obviously, and it's essentially impossible to truly tell with few exceptions. Having said that, we are seeing interesting cases of IO that lead to tangible real-world impact that we can point at. I would say Slovakia is a key example. In Slovakia, pro-Russian actors released an audio deepfake of the leading anti-Russia candidate at the time, who in the audio deepfake essentially admitted to being corrupt. He accepted some bribes or something, according to the audio file, right? Now, they released it a day or two prior to the elections actually beginning, at which point he was unable legally to respond. And that was a case in which it was believed, for example, that may have actually tilted the elections one way or the other, right, against him in this case. So there have been cases where we can point at it being reasonably effective. I would say any situation in which it leads to a tangible impact, right, at the targeted level, we can say that that's pretty effective. But there's certainly no question that, simply having larger protests being fanned by this online activity, especially in the context of Russia, Ukraine, and Israel, Iran, can be certainly quite tangible as well. No one can really tell. Domestically, it's also much harder to gauge, certainly to say the least, especially in countries that are a bit more closed off. What I would say, though, and consider is that while we think about how we gauge the impact, and there are all these scales, so there's the Ben breakout scale, which I think is probably the better way of thinking about it on the whole. It's also important to understand that we usually, especially as people from the global West in this case, whatever you want to call it, don't think about this in certain ways. We may see certain content that we think to be amateurish or unappealing, but it's in fact quite popular in a given country or whatever happens to be, right? It's difficult to gauge, and there are different cultural elements here that are important to consider. And we also, I would say, usually look at certain platforms, Twitter, maybe a bit of Facebook, maybe a bit of YouTube, or so on. And there are many other platforms that are critical, whether it's the LLMs that we brought up earlier that can change, people's minds or influence them in ways that we truly have no idea or ways to gauge, right? Or other platforms like Reddit or forums or so on, in which we also don't really invest much time and effort in gauging them. So we're still in very early days of trying to even truly understand this on the whole, I would say. Now, when it comes to that, really, it's just a matter of trying to gauge it, I would say, in relation to other activities going on.
So let me ask a question here, kind of in relation to that. So if we look into actors that are actually doing well, one of the question here is the chat in the chat is there any state actors that have made significant development in their game, i.e., in their IO game, that you can point the finger, and not necessarily the usual suspects? Maybe let's look at, maybe there's other ones. And by the way, not necessarily for negative purposes. I want to say sometimes we see IO, when I say negative, positive, it's a subjective framing, but not necessarily for war or for regime destabilization. But do we see states that are using IO in such a way that is, you got to say, wow, they really got a good game going on for them?
I mean, I would say two countries, funnily enough. Now, one of them is the big one that we said earlier, which is Iran, which we can discuss more in depth if you want. And they're a leading example of how you can do a lot with a little, which we can get into if we have time or we want to. I would say that beyond that, there are a few other countries. The number one country, though, that I would say I think that's most of interest would probably be the US. We don't need to discuss specific operations here, but there have been multiple cases of operations that I believe are US affiliated that have impressed me and I think are quite are of interest to say the least. The issue is that the Western ones are much harder to track and look at unless you really have your finger on the pulse and are looking at it. And I try to avoid going into too much detail. So I would say the West, and this is an important point, is learning how to utilize this as a lever of geopolitical power, right? And it is like any other element, right? Whether it's diplomacy, military power, economic influence, and so on. So that's something I would also consider looking out for. Beyond also America and Iran. I mean, we can look at a few other countries and so on. Belarus, I would say, overperforms considering their size. The Ghostwriter campaign was quite interesting, I would say, on the whole. If we wanted to look in that, we could discuss that also. In the Ghostwriter campaign, Belarusian operators are suspected of having hacked Ukrainian and Polish Facebook accounts and so on of various officials, and then once they hack them, utilizing them to share their own messages, right, and so on. It really depends where we happen to want to be looking. Venezuela, they've had some stuff. I haven't been super impressed by it, frankly. If we want to avoid Russia, China, and Iran, I would say look at Belarus. They still do interesting stuff, by the way, in the context of the war, also, because they're still very much involved in it. And also look at Western activity.
So it's interesting because what we're seeing is, and maybe here, if I put it on a timeline, we see more and more actors are drawn into the use of IO, and we see democratic states using IO in different ways. Would you say that this is a trend that's going to increase with time or decrease with time? Considering, and here I'm going to add a little element, AI is not only used for IO, but against IO as well. So it's becoming harder because AI is used for defense, not just for offense. Do we see these trends peaking or declining?
Good question. I also will just add quickly that defensively, I was referring to offensive use of IO previously. Defensively, if you want to look at interesting countries to look at, I'd recommend looking at the Philippines and Singapore, who have been very active recently. The Philippines much more vocally encountering Chinese influence operations, and Singapore's dipping their feet into the water more and more over time, and they've had some interesting, statements regarding that as of late. I can tell you that regarding more states getting involved in this, we certainly see Western states getting more and more involved in this, to say the least. It's already happening, and I see it, and we know I'm sure other people do also as well. And I think it's going to be continuing. AI, I feel, will certainly be of interest and important to Western states, but it's really more about fusing it in the broader toolkit of activities, right? It's not as if I think that is also relating back to the previous question. IO in of itself, running a Twitter botnet is in of itself is not necessarily the most impactful thing. But when you fuse it with military activity or diplomatic stuff or cyber operations, or whatever it happens to be, it can be used really as an effective force multiplier in ways that can be much more tangible than being run in of itself. And I think that other countries are starting to gauge that now, which is something that, say, China and Iran and Russia have known for quite a while. So we're certainly going to see, I think, more of it. AI will make it cheaper and easier to do also as well. And then beyond that, I think that we're still just going to continue on an upward trend of everyone trying to psyop each other in the near future.
So we're entering the last kind of section of our webinar. We still have like 12 minutes, but we entered a little bit about how AI can be used for defense. There is a question here in the chat about how would you recommend the private sector to gather information, look at everything, yes, impossible, or to be able to challenge fake news for operation that try to harm the company. In other words, what can a small company, middle company, big company do in order to protect themselves from IO campaigns targeting their operations and targeting their service products, etc.?
Small and medium-sized companies are going to have a hard time doing this, to be entirely frank. It's a specialized field at this point in time. There aren't many service providers that do it. The business models will have to change, whether it's getting more trained people out there that are capable of working on this stuff, more varied service offerings that kind of can target other companies. I think the MSSP model, for example, makes quite a bit of sense for this sort of thing to look at. There's a lot of stuff to consider there. What was the first part of the question? Just because I know we had a bunch of points I wanted to talk on. I didn't want to miss all of them. I'm trying
So,
to
so
think about how I want to structure it.
so to generalize, the question is, what can companies do to protect themselves against IO campaigns? Specifically, the question was, should they, for example, gather information, monitoring it on a regular basis, or should they be developing some sort of capabilities against this challenge of fake news that can target their companies out there? Is there
This
something
is
they can do?
It's an excellent question. And when you're dealing with a nation state adversary, frankly, there's very little a company can do in response to be in the same case with cyber operations, by the way. When a company gets hacked by a nation state, they can't respond back. They're not able to hack back, for example, as they say. There's a lot of discussion of that now as a hot topic, right? We're going to need to see governments get involved for the official response, right? If we will. We're also going to need, in my opinion, see social media companies begin to change certain policies and enable legal and other framework responses for companies to have an easier time when they're targeted. We're still working on the regulatory elements of that, as it's quite difficult to do without impinging upon, excuse me, free speech and so on. And I think also, certainly in many cases, simply identifying the content or identifying the people behind it is going to be quite difficult. Usually for governments, I recommend the goal is to move past passive monitoring, because passive monitoring, while important, is reactionary. Right? When you're reactionary, you're going to have a hard reacting to activity. You're always going to have a hard time handling it. But on the other hand, sorry, there's a bit of noise here in the background. Being proactive is essentially a space that we only let governments really act in, right? Companies also have their hands tied because they can't necessarily run, blue networks, let's say, of defensive assets in many cases legally too. So we still need to have legal frameworks be set up by governments enabling this. We need to have governments be willing to support their clients. We need to have companies begin to invest in this, even just as a general awareness sort of thing to enable what can be done, and to also try to proactively minimize their attack surface, right? Registering domains, verifying accounts, having all the infrastructure and assets in place prior, so that if there's an impersonation attack, if their companies or assets get targeted online, they have the ability at least to respond to it effectively, in terms of official statements, if they can't get it taken down, let's say.
So we spoke about state actors. We spoke a little bit about the private sector more as the victim and the target. I want to touch shortly about the potential that non-state actors, and in my mind, the number one was ISIS and their use of social media for recruitment, for propaganda, for even for basically terrorism in terms of like terrorizing society and so on. Um, how do you see non-state actors using IO and using the social networks, the internet, for their purposes of using IO for their own goals and objectives?
So I would say the two main groups to look at, like you said, are ISIS is a great example, but extremist groups, be they religious or political, and also, of course, organized crime, right? Cartels and other organized crime groups are the two main interesting ones, primarily cartels, I would say, in that front. ISIS was certainly a leader in the space. They were active primarily on Telegram. Now, many of these, and Twitter, of course, also as well. Many of these groups are going to have different things going on for them that we need to consider also as well. They don't oftentimes necessarily need to have the same level of secrecy, right? A big part of this, for example, in operations is your level of covertness. If you don't mind being officially affiliated with ISIS or, being caught or having your asset burned or so on, or them knowing your IP address is out there in some corner of Iraq or whatever it happens to be, then you can act much more easily. So it's harder to counter, right? If you don't care about being exposed in the space, and in many cases, by the way, it's good for you to be exposed because it raises your profile and so on, then you can act much more effectively and at a much higher scale. So it's more, I think, of a volume and scale question than it is to say necessarily quality or other types of content. So far, on the whole, I've seen that been an issue primarily for governments, right? Not as much for private businesses at this point in time. And we've seen a bit of a dip in it also as of late. There was some stuff a few years ago with some extremist groups in Southeast Asia and other and other regions that were interesting in terms of the IO stuff they ran. But I would say the more threat that we have there is, of course, radicalization and incitement to violence in larger groups. Where that goes in terms of the broader IO context, we'll see. There have also been cases of far-right groups in the US, for example, utilizing IO in some cases, where there was a group called Patriot Front a while back that ran covert influence operations to promote their own extremist views inside of the states, for example. But we haven't seen any true large-scale success, I would say, at that level just yet, beyond ISIS, which was an interesting example.
So before we go into the scenarios, kind of a last question, which is essentially, you spoke a little bit about legislation changes. What states should change when it comes to how they perceive, how they act, how they view and see the threat coming from IO? What are the internal changes in terms of legislation or budgeting or whatever that countries should be paying more attention and should be working on in order to kind of to minimize the threat of IO and IO campaigns?
There are two elements to consider, the offensive and the defensive, right? And of course, there's relevant legislation for all these things. I'm not interested in calling for any limitations on free speech or so on. That's not I think, the way to go about it. I think the interesting thing is that states need to develop foundational capacities, both offensively and defensively. Early examples of this include France and Sweden and Finland, for example, that have created their own, in the case of Sweden and Finland, psychological defense agencies that fuse both domestic resilience efforts with investigative capacities. And then you have Viginum in France, for example, that does technical investigations into foreign influence operations and publishes on them. Now, we've seen also certain cases, other countries begin to publish on these things also as well. In the US, there was a successful one in the FBI. The FBI, the Foreign Line Influence Task Force, that in the last elections was successful at taking down Russian content and Chinese content and Iranian content very effectively. But defensively, it's all about having domestic capabilities, including strong open source intelligence capabilities, which are often lacking for many governments, right? So having foundational capacities in that regard, having the legal foundations to work against foreign interference, not domestic discussion, right? Not that sort of thing, but foreign interference, and then beginning to fuse an element of offensive activity into it. And a big case of this, for example, is when the U.S. Cyber Force allegedly targeted Russian influence operators, for example, via cyber attacks prior to the US elections in 2020, right? Shutting down their offices and so on, right? So we've seen cases of that where you can utilize certain, operations to, at key points in time, limit via cyber or other types of operations the capacities of operators. And we also see more naming and shaming of foreign influence operators, right? How effective that is, you indict some Chinese people or some Russians or so on. How effective that is remains to be seen. It's more of a signaling thing than it is anything else. But it's certainly a trend that we've seen also as well. I would say the move is to get essentially as high up upon the kill chain as we can possibly get. And a big part of that also is targeting the cyber criminal underground. A lot of foreign influence operations are powered by the cyber criminal underground. For example, renting residential proxies, buying fake accounts, using what are called bulletproof hosting services, all of these things. And they exist not to service influence operations because it's not simply profitable enough. They exist to service cybercrime. And that makes this scalable and much more easy for other countries to utilize. And if that can be targeted, which we see, for example, the US and other countries target Russian bulletproof hosting firms, for example, that can be also quite effective. So it's about adding not only the defensive component and having investigative capabilities defensively, but also having some sort of offensive element involved to actually proactively work and mitigate activity as well.
So we usually like to conclude our webinars with the three scenarios, as we call them, and that is looking into the future. Let me ask the question, and then I think it will be more easy to go with it. So, what would be the best case scenario for information operations in terms of those who are fighting against information operations? So, in other words, in a best case scenario, how are we going to see the world changing in the sense that fighting IO or dealing with IO in a better place, in a better way? That's one. Two, what will be the worst case scenario? Meaning, what can we see that will make it even worse if it's a new technological development such as AI or so on, that will make IO even worse to democracies and for countries, will make the IO as a method something that will see much more, creating much more chaos and damage and so on. And third, the black swan is essentially we would like to see what could you think could be kind of like under the radar situation where maybe a new technology or a new actor might come there, is low likelihood kind of a situation that they might join this IO trend, but their impact will be significant. So it's a low likelihood high impact situation, and that's what we call the black swan.
Okay. So let's start for the best case scenario. I think the best case scenario for IO defense is that an offensive element to some degree is integrated, and the infrastructure that underpins hostile operations is taken down or severely mitigated. Because once that's done, it's then very easy to handle the stuff that remains. For example, if you make it much harder for the adversary to register domains, even, let's say, and you relegate them to focusing on certain high investment areas of activity, right? Like, for example, creating accounts on mass on Facebook, which isn't easy, let's say, then you make it harder for them to scale their operations. It's never possible to fully stop the operation, right, or to stop them from acting, but the goal is to make it as expensive and difficult as possible for them to do so. And if the West and other countries figure out ways to prevent adversaries from like I said, renting servers, registering domains in Western countries, I mean, and being able to use those for operations, that's a win because then it limits them to their ability to act at a larger scale in many ways. That's the best possible case scenario, I would say. Now, the other element to consider there is the AI component. I think the other part of the best case scenario here, and I think we're seeing this already, is that defensive AI will keep pace or be better than in many cases the offensive use of AI by adversaries, right? Where domestic systems and AI detection systems and so on in the West or other targeted countries will be as good as offensive capabilities and will be able to effectively flag and filter out problematic AI content that does, that's violative of laws or other sorts of things like that. And I think that actually we're seeing already happen as well as the first stage too. So I'm optimistic on the whole in many ways. Regarding the next one was a worst case scenario question, and then we had the
So
black swan.
exactly, worst case, and then
Okay. Worst case scenario is that all of the stuff that's been done so far is fully dismantled. Now, I get it. A lot of the stuff is highly problematic, and I'm certainly very cautious of anything that would limit people's free speech and so on. And I don't think that's the way to go about it, which is why I propose focusing on targeting people outside of the borders of a given country, right? Focusing on infrastructure and so on, and trying to avoid content right to the highest degree possible, right? The goal isn't to be the content police, it's to understand what networks of foreign influence exist and work against those, not just to a certain post or hashtag or so on. So the worst case scenario is what we have essentially that's happened so far is being dismantled. We see a little bit of this in the US with certain people in the US government acting against the Foreign Blind Influence Task Force and defunding certain efforts in that regard. On the other hand, we have other positive elements of certain states, for example, taking up the mantle. Texas just signed their first counter foreign blind influenced unit, for example, like last week, right under the Department of Public Security. Now, the other element to consider in terms of the worst case scenario is that I think we focus on the reactive approach, where we focus on fact checking, we focus on utilizing AI to analyze content at scale, and we take this into a problematic area of content and arguing over narratives and content and not focusing on exclusively. I'd say not that we shouldn't look at those at all, right? But as the main battlefield, let's say, and we relegate or leave alone. I'm sorry, not relegate, but we essentially ignore the things that enable our adversaries to work in the stage, right? The goal is to not, as they say, the joke about it's about arguing with an idiot, right? When you argue with an idiot, it'll take you down to your level and beat to his level and beat you. That's the joke, right? You want to avoid that. The goal is to not get into a battle, in my opinion, a battle of narratives.
when it comes to a black swan shortly, what would you say is a black swan kind of a scenario for IO? Is there like I mean, we're talking a lot about AI, we're talking about the actors that were involved, the big one, but is there any kind of I would say a technology or an actor that you kind of see under the radar that is kind of growing that could have a major impact, but currently their likelihood is low?
I think that the RAGs or like autonomous agents in AI are still not been fully integrated effectively into IO, and that could be the big deal that we see next, right? Having truly autonomous AI agents run large numbers of accounts or things online is something that we haven't seen. We've seen cases of people using to write posts and so on, right? But we haven't seen the full end-to-end automation. And that I think will be the next stage, not only of running accounts, by the way, online, but also of the whole process, right? Currently, AI helps you, but you need to guide it through each stage. All right, now it's going to generate my video, then it's going to write my post, then I'm going to do this, and then I'm going to throw it all together and post it, right? When we get to the point where we have fully autonomous agents, and this is possible, arguably already, doing everything end to end, right? Generating and creating the content, and then also working with it online and engaging with audiences in an effective fashion, and also doing that on locally hosted models, right, that aren't connected to the internet, so they can't be targeted, or connected to the internet via other methods. I mean, that I think would be the big black swan moment that we see, because that could be a moment where it's quite difficult, if not impossible, to identify it, but also, of course, take it down. I think if I have is Owen frozen or have I frozen here? Got it. Thank you. Okay, let's see. I'll take some questions then in the meantime, and then we'll be signing off soon. JR, regarding social
Can
engineering.
you see me?
Oh,
Can you
sorry,
hear
yeah,
me?
Owen. Yeah, you're back.
Yes, sorry for that. Some internet issue, but I moved to my phone, so now it's okay. Sorry for that.
No
So you were
problem.
saying about the Black Swan. You were saying that, and that's the Black Swan event is that new technology that's basically going to be an AI from end to end, basically.
Yes, the full integration of AI into every element of this and fusing it together also, not just doing one thing individually, which is what we've seen so far.
Understood. Well, Ari, the last minute there I was disconnected, but basically that was the last question. We ran out of time. Ari, thank you so much for taking the time today. I want to thank everybody also who joined us today for this really informative webinar, really great insights here. Ari, thank you so much for joining us. Thank you all the guests. And we'll see you in our next webinars that we're going to be conducting down the road this month and the next month. Thank you, everybody. Thank you, Ari.
Thank you. It was a pleasure.
Thank you. Bye-bye.